Hey folks, Randy Newberg here with another episode of Leupold's Hunt Talk Radio. Today is, well, my first day of feeling that I can sit upright. I went to a bunch of trade shows and I got sick as a dog. Sicker than most dogs. But thankfully, I've gained enough of my faculties that today is a great day to have a conversation with a guy who's been on our podcast before, Dr. Kevin Monteith, who runs the Monteith lab down in Laramie, Wyoming at the University of Wyoming. He is so well respected, such a great communicator of the really complicated science that they work on related to mule deer, pronghorn, elk, sheep, moose, migrations, how landscapes get used, the impacts of human presence in all of its forms. Every time I talk to Kevin, I feel so I feel like I've went through life so ignorant as it relates to these topics, and I just enjoy the conversations with him. He and I got to have a meeting at the Wild Sheep Foundation's sheep show in Reno last month, and we got to talking about a lot of topics that we know are out there. And we decided to do another podcast. So as quick as I get done doing this introduction, he's on the other line, and we got a whole lot of things we're going to talk about. I hope. Uh, I know I'm going to learn a lot. I always do with him and a lot of other scientists. And Kevin's always the guy who wants to give the credit to his collaborators and the people he works with, and they deserve a ton of credit. And he's got an amazing team of people. He's got an event happening in Laramie, Wyoming next month in March that he invited me down to be the keynote speaker for. And my worry is that he's going to find out that just because I'm free doesn't mean I'm good. But if I can help him in the research that he does, and the research requires funding, and that's the whole idea, is to raise money for the work that they do. But I know that when he was on the podcast a few years ago, so many people got a hold of us and said, please, more of Dr. Monteith, more of Kevin, please. So that's what you're going to get today. And I hope that you find it as eye-opening and as, in some cases, confirming of what I think, but then also times of putting a wet blanket on what I think, which I guess is part of what our goal is, right? We always want to have the curious mind that's not afraid to be stretched in a certain direction, or not afraid to have our ignorances pointed out to us. And that's my goal. And Kevin does a good job of filling in a lot of the places where I've got blind spots. And he's here with us. So appreciate y'all being here. And in just a second, you're going to get to see Kevin and I, or listen to Kevin and I, have a really good conversation. Appreciate you being here. Dr. Kevin Monteith, all the way from Laramie, Wyoming. How you doing, Kevin?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me, Randy.
Yeah, I haven't seen you for about 10 days.
I know. And it sounds like you had a near-death experience since last I saw you.
Man, you know what happened? I went over to you and started talking about how I made it through all these shows. I haven't been sick yet. And by the time I landed in Montana, I wasn't feeling right. And then 2 days later, death tried to break into my doorway, I'm afraid. So if I sound or look pale or fall off this chair, don't be surprised.
But you survived through it, right? And you're still
Yeah,
here. Yeah.
I'm glad you escaped. You made it through without getting sick?
Yeah, my whole crew made it through. Nobody
Oh,
nobody got sick, which doesn't. We had one of our crew last year got was deathly ill. So
really?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
I
we
I
definitely haven't escaped all the time.
yeah, well, I suspect that if somewhere in the disease world they wanted to do research about herd immunity and stuff, the SHOT Show in Las Vegas or one of the hunting shows like you and I were at would be a really good place to do some test samples.
Agreed. There's a
Uh,
huge sample population to be had right there.
yeah, Marcus, who works for me, has an undergrad in wildlife management. And this morning he and I were talking, and he said, well, just think of it this way. There's herd immunities, and back in the day, or if you were an elk and you're trying to develop herd immunity, as sick as you were this week, the wolves would have eaten you this week.
You would have been selected against very
Yeah,
quickly. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I couldn't have outrun anything.
yeah.
But anyhow, thanks for taking the time. You're always so generous with your time when I reach out to you that I I don't know why, but you are, and I'm grateful for that. And so is the audience. So, uh,
Well, my pleasure. I appreciate all you do, and
yeah,
working to get the information out there and have the right communication. So I'm happy to do my best to contribute to that.
you do a great job with that. Not just on podcast, but you answer a lot of emails from me, and I'm sure you're probably like, oh, not him again. But
No, no, all good. Randy, do you remember when we first met? Do you know we met at the sheep show?
I know you were. We were waiting in the elevators, and you had your kids and everybody with you,
Yeah, yeah. I had
and
my son with me, and I think I followed you into the elevator with. Yeah, I
yeah,
just saw your. I think you were pulling a suitcase, maybe with all your podcast equipment and stuff like that, and it said
yeah.
Newberg on it, and I was like, nah, there's no way. And I saw
uh,
you from the side. I'm like, wait, it is. No kidding. Yeah. What are the odds of
yeah.
that?
No, that was great that we got to meet there and introduce ourselves. And now, kind of a continuation of that is you are having an event in Laramie, Wyoming. Uh, Hopefully, it's to raise money
Hmm.
for the work that you do at the Monteith lab there at the University of Wyoming. Uh, and you asked me to be a part of it, and I couldn't say yes fast enough. I feel like I'm slightly balancing the ledger, but I'll still be in debt to you. So
No,
what is that event? So otherwise we're going to get into this and we're going to forget about it. And I told
it's
you we got to talk about it so people know to be there.
yeah, yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate that. So this year the event's April 11th, and uh, as we as there's many fundraisers and activities that are out there, nonprofit organizations lead and stuff like that, and we've been had a very close working relationship with Muley Fanatic Foundation for many years now, basically since they started.
Hmm.
And with that and their efforts to raise money, help be a good partner, and support the work that we do, they've always placed a high bar on having sound information, good science to help inform decision making. And so,
Yeah.
as we've worked so closely with them for years, we thought, well, why don't we sort of design an event that's based around science essentially, and just partner together and do that. And so it's a typical fundraising event that Monteith Shop here does in partnership with Muley Fanatic Foundation. And the aim, of course, to raise money, but at the same time, do our best to be able to just engage the audience and the folks that are there in attendance on scientific discoveries, bits and pieces that we're learning. And then, of course, my team is going to be there as well to be able to interact with those in attendance. And so this is our second one. We did the first one last year. It was a lot of fun, and we're looking forward to doing it again this year. And we're expecting a full house because we're bringing in Randy Newberg. And so tickets are going to sell very quickly. They already are. The more we get the information out, so we need people to reserve their tables, reserve their tickets, because shoot, it's gonna fill up. So
Well,
yeah,
I,
yeah.
I hope I don't show up and there's only three people in the seats, and you guys say, "Well, we should have paid somebody rather than got a volunteer like him. Isn't worth it. We would have been money ahead to pay somebody."
All
But
right.
no, I'm blessed that I get to do it, and I really appreciate you reaching out. It'll be fun.
No, for sure. We're excited to have you. Yeah, it's going to be a good time. We're looking
Yeah.
forward to it.
Well, this podcast, like most of the podcasts that I ask you and other scientists to be part of, is to try take the really complicated world of science and help me communicate it to hunters in not a way that is always what they want to hear, but what they need to hear, or what you and I maybe think they need to hear. Uh, and fortunately, a lot of times, what we think they need to hear is probably what they do want to hear. So it's always well received from that standpoint. Uh, we'll probably focus a lot on mule deer just because you live in such an amazing mule deer place, and it's so dynamic, undergoing so many changes. And if possible, talk about how that might apply to other places, but also to other species, and it'll. I guess where I want to start is one, just the basics of Kevin. You just the audience might already know who you are, but there might be some people who are like, "Who's this guy? What's his gig?" So besides being just a passionate hunter, you you're a South Dakota boy. Do I remember that right?
Yeah, I'm just small town South Dakota kid. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. Tried and true redneck, and that's never gonna leave me. So yes, sir.
your science background takes you from, was it, are you a coyote or a jackrabbit? Aren't that
Jackrabbit. So yeah, yeah.
okay?
Two degrees at South Dakota State. So bachelor's and master's there. Before I then um, ventured off into the great unknown for a naive kid who had been to very few places in this world, and got drugged to California to work on mule deer there. And then my degree was at Idaho State. So
Okay,
I went west. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's what happened to me also growing up in northern Minnesota. I was the freshest turnip to ever fall off the turnip truck, and yeah, I went from a town of 500 people to the Twin Cities of, a few million, to Phoenix of a few million. I was so far out of water. I'm like, I got to get back to the country, and so I moved to Montana, and I thought Bozeman was going to be a pretty quiet place, and then all of a sudden Kevin Costner did some TV series called Yellowstone, and tipped this place on its head. So, but oh well. But we share some of that background, share
Yeah.
our passion for hunting, but really where you are the expert and I'm the uninformed student is when it comes to so much of wildlife science. I think all hunters are consumers of that science, but I'm guilty of consuming it very often in the way that supports my predetermined bias. We got to shoot more lions. I don't be telling me this stuff. And then I listen. I'm like, well, okay, I better think about that. Better think about this. And so, for me, when I think about where you live or where you do a lot of your study, Western Wyoming, I've had mule deer tags there 4 times in my life, and I hope I see a fifth and a sixth and a seventh, but maybe I won't. I might not. I don't know. Just you never know. When you get to be in your 60s, you start. This is morbid. You start looking at obituaries. I just turned 61. I'm like, how many people I'd look at who have a six in front of their. I better get doing some more hunting here. So I don't know how many more Western Wyoming mule deer hunts I'll have, but they've been remarkable. All of them. The quality of the deer, the quality of the habitat, at least the places where I go to when I hunt them, is very remarkable. And you always have replied to me and my questions where it all starts with fat does. And I think that's what we're going to call the title of this podcast. Fat does equal big bucks,
Hmm.
or I don't know, healthy herds. Fat does equals something.
Hmm.
And you always tell me you want to have the fattest does possible.
Hmm.
Am I understanding you correctly when you say that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, essentially, and what that means. I mean, what that means in general is, within a specific location or within a specific area, given the conditions and how those animals in that area are adapted to that area, the fatter the animals are, um, the greater buffer they have to survive, to reproduce. And then that also means that that dynamic is passed from one generation to the next and plays an enormous role in producing big bucks down the road, essentially, for
Yeah.
animals to express their full genetic potential. That comes from adequate nutrition, and the majority of that nutrition is actually founded in mom, and
Hmm,
what she does to set the stage for what that buck is going to become later in life.
really? In what way? Just in the first year of life, first few months of life,
Good
at
question.
birth?
Yeah, so I might need to sidestep and tell
Sure,
a quick story if
please do.
you let me do that. So
Yeah.
I've talked about this work a number of different times, but I think, of all the work I've had the luxury of being a part of, probably never would I have realized at the time that the work that I did in South Dakota as like an undergrad leaning into master students was going to be one of like the cleanest examples of the role of nutrition and maternal, so mom's nutrition in the life of animals and in particular males. And so what we did within that study, so for those familiar with South Dakota, or even if you're not, Eastern South Dakota is agriculturally dominated region, corn and
Hmm.
soybeans essentially, and has been for a really long time. That's why Vern Blake, when he recruited me to California, he said, "Well, the tallest mountain he's ever seen is the height of corn stalks in a cornfield," which was there's a lot of truth to that before I left South Dakota, and then I got thrown into the Sierra Nevada, so I went
Uh,
from one extreme to the other. But
uh,
so what that means in that country, at least, is good nutrition for whitetail
mhm.
deer in that region.
Yep.
And then the Black Hills in southwestern South Dakota. So ponderosa pine dominated forests, a lot of fire suppression for a number of years, and at least historically, that region was known to produce some very impressive deer. You go
Hmm,
into some of the bars in Custer or other places in the Black Hills, and there's some incredible whitetail deer hanging on the walls.
hmm,
However, it had been years, at least at that point in time in the like 80s to 90s, where it just they were more known for
hmm.
small deer, both body size, antler size, to the extent of like being over 100 pounds difference between deer from the Black Hills to deer from eastern South Dakota.
Wow.
And so, given that observation and then the associated question, the idea was is that genetically driven? So are animals from the Black Hills just genetically different? And this is what we'll often refer to, right? We're
Hmm.
like, those animals are genetically like this. Over
Right.
here, we have the genetics to produce big animals.
Yeah.
So to test that, we did what's called a common garden experiment. So all that meant was we took newborn fawns from the Black Hills, newborn fawns from eastern South Dakota, and brought them to our captive research facilities outside of South Dakota State in Brookings, South Dakota. And
Hmm.
then what we did is basically from day one, we hand raised them and put them on a high nutritional plane through their entire life,
Okay.
and then looked at the growth of those males all the way to adulthood. So we have those initial animals, wild stock animals from Black Hills, from eastern South Dakota, on an identical diet since they were born. And so
Huh.
what that meant once we reached peak body mass in antler size is the males that originated from the Black Hills were 30% smaller in body mass and nearly 30% smaller in antler size than males from eastern South Dakota.
Huh.
even though since day one they were raised with identical nutrition. We raised them in the exact same way. In fact, they were all right next to each other
Hmm.
within our facilities. So at that surface level, what that could have told us, right, is that okay, well they must be genetically different, right? Since day
Hmm.
one, they're raised with the same nutrition, radically different sizes. In fact, if you just witness them in person, I mean, I worked around these animals every day, and you
Yeah.
see them in person or you see pictures of them, and there is like completely different deer. Those Black Hills animals, I mean, the males from eastern South Dakota just dwarf those animals from the Black Hills.
Yeah.
But then we took that work one step further, and we produced the next generation of offspring within our facilities. So Black Hills, we had Black Hills males and females that bred, and then we raised their offspring, so that second generation of animals. And then Eastern South Dakota males and females that originated as wild stock as newborns, they produced young, and we raised those second generation animals, Eastern South Dakota Black Hills, and we raised them to adulthood. And so the second generation males that were Eastern South Dakota, they grew identical to their dads. Like if you look at their growth line and body mass, their growth line and antler size, they almost lay right on top of each other. There was
Huh.
no difference. However, the males for the second generation Black Hills animals, those males, once they reached adulthood and peak size, were 30% bigger than their dads in body mass, 26% bigger than their dads in antler size. Same genetic line, right?
Yeah.
Same genetic line, raised in the exact same conditions, but their offspring like got huge compared with dads.
Yeah.
So what that means, and it goes back to the question you just asked, is it nutrition within first year of life? Is it nutrition of mom? Where does that play out with regards to maternal nutrition? Well, one of the biggest places that it plays out, as that example demonstrates, is maternal nutrition while the young are in utero. So while mom is gestating those young. So the
Hmm.
reason we saw huge differences in growth between Eastern South Dakota and Black Hills animals is because they were reflecting the conditions of mom in gestation from where they were born, because they were born to Black Hills females in the Black Hills, born to Eastern South Dakota females in Eastern South Dakota. So they carried the signature of the conditions that mom experienced from those places, and it stuck with them all the way to adulthood.
Huh.
Then we go on to the next generation. Now, this is after conditions have improved. So moms now that are in our facilities that we had captured as newborns, but had been raised under high quality nutrition and are now experiencing high quality nutrition, now basically pass on that signal of nutrition to their offspring. So their offspring are getting the silver spoon right out of the gate. And then they end up producing males that honestly, yep, male offspring that dwarf their fathers. And again, like you see pictures of them together, and it's almost silly. It's like runty dad, giant son. And the only difference again is mom's nutrition. And the reason why we didn't see a response in those Eastern South Dakota animals, as in their growth was identical, is simply because nutrition was already adequate in that country. And so those males were exhibiting their nutritional potential. So even with the improved nutrition in that way, we didn't really see big differences. They grew the same because they were exhibiting their nutritional potential versus the animals from the Black Hills. All it took was one generation to see that enormous change. And almost certainly, had we been able to keep going with additional generations of animals, I anticipate we would have seen additional jumps in subsequent generations. But even still, single generation of improved nutrition carrying the signature of mom when those young were in utero through their entire lifetime. And that's the other thing, right? Once they were in our facilities, once they were fed food in our facilities as a newborn, their nutrition was really, really good for their entire lives,
Yeah.
right? So it's the notion that even if conditions approve after young are born, they're still going to carry the signature of mom. and her nutritional signature that she's passing on to young, even if things get better for that
Wow.
male later in life.
Huh.
So
So
that's
it,
why, I mean, there's all the other dynamics just within a population for producing, rearing young, surviving through bad winters or whatever the case may be. But you have fat moms, yields the opportunity for them to pass on that nutritional signature to her offspring, not just females, but males as well. That's going to set them on a trajectory to exhibit their nutritional potential later in life and thus be bigger than they would otherwise if mom was in poor nutritional condition.
that's amazing because so often you hear, "Oh, we just don't have the genetics for healthy
Yes.
deer, for old, whatever it might be." Huh. Fat does. You hear that, folks? Whatever you do, try to have the fattest does you can. Okay, whatever your landscape is, make it even better for the does. The buck part will take care of itself. So
That's right.
take care of mom, and everything else goes from there.
That's right.
Huh. That's amazing.
Yeah, and
Uh,
as you said too, I mean that the common reference of, oh, we don't have the genetics for that in this area. I think what we have to remember is that these animals over time become adapted even nutritionally to the environment they live in
yeah,
based on the nutrition they gain, how they can subsequently allocate it to either survive through a summer, to survive through a winter. And it sets that balance for the animal, which then anchors a lot of what we see from one region to the next with regards to them exhibiting that potential. So much of it is driven by nutrition, just like that example, Black Hills to eastern South Dakota. Those Black Hills animals, they were fine. They were adapted to the nutrition that was available to them within the Black Hills, and we were just seeing what that meant for those animals.
yeah.
They're simply smaller antlers, smaller body, which enabled their persistence in that environment. And the moment, at least across generational time, that improved markedly, and we began to see that return nutritionally on what those animals can do.
That is so fascinating when you think about what an adaptation that is and how immediate that is. Which then gets me to uh, some of the fattest deer I ever see are on the summer range of Wyoming and parts of southeast Idaho, parts of Colorado. They look like pigs in the summertime. They walk and they're in August, they're just rippling with fat.
Mhm.
And there must be habitat there or nutritional. I mean, habitat has to be broken down into quality and quantity. So you can have habitat that maybe doesn't have that nutritional quantity and quality that other habitats have. So
Correct.
is it safe to say that those places where I see these obese, fat deer, whether they're bucks or does, that speaks to the quantity and quality of the nutritional portion of the habitat?
Yes, 100%. In part because you have to have adequate nutrition for those animals to do that, for them to be able to survive, persist, and accrue that level of fat reserves. They have to have the nutritional potential within the environment that they live to do that. The other thing to consider simultaneously, as we just talked about animals being adapted to their environment,
Hmm.
animals within a lot of the country that you reference, they migrate out of that high country, typically end up on these sagebrush basins over winter,
Hmm.
and winter isn't always an easy season for them to persist through. And
Right.
so what that means for them is, as a general rule, they need to come into winter with sufficient fat reserves to buffer them against bad winters or an inability for them to meet their daily metabolic requirements through the course of the winter. You can liken it to like an animal packing on a backpack full of high energy groceries and just taking that with them as they go down to winter range, right? They're still going to
Hmm.
feed on winter range, but they're still contending with that environment where food is less available. They may be dealing with inclement weather, deep snow that's affecting their access to food. And if you have that backpack or that's full of energy rich food or fat for them, that allows them to slowly draw on that through the course of the winter to help them meet their daily energetic requirements. And so part of why you're seeing that is because animals in those systems as well, they're sort of, again, adapted to that system. They're pre-programmed to undergo those seasonal cycles in body fat and to gain the level of fat that helps them, aids them in persisting through the following winter. But you're right in that if they don't have the right nutrition there, they can't get that fat. They're just not going to be able to obtain and acquire the resources that support them in getting that fat. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the cool part for males with that, which I think this is, we've come to appreciate this more and more in recent years. We think about females a lot in their ability. They need the energetic resources to, one, survive, two, have that energy to allocate to their young, right? To
Hmm.
provision them in utero and once they hit the ground through lactation. And so they're constantly balancing that process from their survival to allocating resources to reproduction to gaining body fat. For males, their life is far more simple. Even though we often say like, oh, they're super risky because of the rut, actually you can maybe say that they engage in risky behavior by battling it out, right? And they can die in a severe battle that they end up losing through the course of
Hmm.
the rut, sure. But for males, it's right. We often need it simpler. For males, it's far simpler. All they're doing through the course of the summer is they're just growing, getting bigger, gaining body fat through the course of the summer, right?
Yeah.
And then as the rut comes, testosterone levels spike. But the primary energetic cost that they experience during the rut is just not eating. So
Yeah.
it's not all the running around, it's just not eating. By not eating, it frees them up to engage in the rut, right? They
Yeah.
don't have to invest the time and taking time to eat. It just frees up their activity, essentially, their time allotment to be able to invest in rutting behavior. But what we see is that their food intake is very, and how much they lose through the rut is just almost completely dictated by how much fat they have going into the rut. And so
Hmm.
for them, compared to the female, for males, it's simple. You have the rut. I come in at, male comes in at 23% body fat. He's going to burn all that fat all the way down to about 6 or 7% body fat. At least that's what we see in Western
Wow.
Wyoming. And so, but then it's just a hard line, right? And we often see, males that disengage from the rut, bull
Yeah.
elk that are off by themselves. Well, they've spent what they had and now they're done. And so then they move on and they need to allocate their time otherwise to resting and recovery post rut. So I think it's really interesting that
Huh.
females are sort of like constantly playing the game of this careful balance all the way through the year because for most of them, they're almost always investing in reproduction in some form.
Right.
By the time they're weaning, they're conceiving again and then
Yeah.
gestating and then putting young on the ground. And so it's like constant for them. For a
Yeah.
male, it's like a 2 week, 3 week period, and they know what they have going into it. So they know how much they can spend through the course of it. And so it makes it a pretty hard line and a bit simpler for them. But what that also says in reference, as you talked about, for those males that get really, really fat in some of that country, they got a lot of fat reserves that they can spend during the rut.
Huh. Oh, that's a great way to look at it. So, can I take from that a really poor, a skinny buck compared to a fat buck, he's only going to be able to invest so much of his energy reserves in the rut before he'll have to just shut it down and say, if I keep behaving this way, I'm going to die. So, I don't know if it's the conscious decision, but he ends up opting out of the intense parts of the rut sooner than the fat buck.
That's right. That physiological response between how fat they are and then their feeding, right? Because those males, they're not gonna be able to continue not eating. It's called
Yeah,
hypophagia.
yeah,
And it's incredible how much they'll just stop eating. It's
hmm,
amazing. I mean, we've done studies when I worked with those captive deer in eastern South Dakota where we put them in metabolic boxes where we're monitoring their food intake and stuff like that. So they're not able to like run around, chase females and stuff like that. And so there's food and water put right in front of their face.
Hmm.
And they will, testosterone levels spike and they just won't eat, even though it's
Wow.
right in front of them. The amount of forage intake that drops through the course of especially the peak of the rut, it's
Hmm.
incredible, and it's so strongly tied to the reserves that they have with them. So yeah, what that means for those males that have either spent it or don't have as much going into it, they either disengage or they're going to have to spend time eating. They're not going to be able to just continue to maintain that level of activity and not eating because
Hmm.
they're not going to meet their daily energy requirements. Otherwise, they'll spend it down too far. Yep.
Huh. So, with that basic premise, I need your guidance about habitat quality and how a hard winter like you guys had in Wyoming in 22 and 23
Mm-hmm.
allows deer to get through that condition, if they do, and if they do, what it means for them, for those who made it through that situation, that now there are fewer mouths
Mm-hmm.
likely stressing that habitat or that forage base, focusing on the forage component of what all the pieces of habitat. Is it safe to say that those deer that I've seen the last few years down there when I've been elk hunting or whatever, they are as obese as they are because they don't have competition for groceries? Or is it just that the habitat improved that much over some short period of time?
Yeah. Yeah. So all very good questions. I think so. To kind of start where you begin there, as you leaned into that question, we don't always. Sometimes we struggle to recognize that in some places where we see animals isn't the only place where they make a living. Their entire life through the course of a year could be played out, one, in the place you see them, and then also in a place that could, 20 to 100 plus miles away from there during the winter. And what's really important for us to remember is that how that plays out for those animals is not in isolation. We, for a long time, have sort of viewed, for example, winter as being the key period. We got to focus on winter range, and in part because that's where the animals die. We see it, right? It's very obvious to us. But for animals like the big ungulates that we talk about a lot, what they experience isn't in isolation, because what they're doing is they're connecting their whole world from that winter range to that migratory route to their summer range and then back again. And simply what that means is because of those fat dynamics that we've been talking about, those animals, much like we talked about maternal nutrition and offspring carrying the signature of mom's nutrition from in utero all the way to adulthood, these animals are carrying the signature of their past seasonal range as they go from one seasonal range to the next. So for example, an animal is up on summer range, and let's say it's a very, very robust summer range, and this female, rears one fawn and still reaches 16% body fat. She takes what she then gained on that summer range, she carries it back with her to that winter range. And what that means is as we face bad winters, or even a winter like 22, 23, is whether or not animals were able to persist through a winter was in part influenced, yes, by the winter conditions that she experienced, but it's also influenced by what she experienced on summer range and how much fat she brought with them. So, what that means, because of how the animal integrates nutrition across seasons, winter range and summer range are inherently linked. And if you're unable to match them up appropriately, or this is what the animal does to persist, then the animal is not going to live. It needs the summer range needs to be sufficient for her to gain enough fat to persist on the corresponding winter range. And this reflects this like nutritional programming that these animals that these animals have to go from one seasonal range to the next. If that
Yeah.
does that track?
Yeah. Yep. In other
Yeah,
words, the, if she comes from a really high quality summer range, her backpack, using your earlier, she's going to have a big backpack full of high energy food to get her through really tough winters, or maybe some drought conditions on the winter range, or whatever it might be that makes that nutritional plane on the winter range harder. Or if her transition range that she migrates through has more obstacles and other delays or consequences, the more her backpack is full, I guess, the greater the likelihood that she's going to get through the transition range, the winter range, and make her way back up to the
that's right.
summer range.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I will. So there's a couple different ways that we can demonstrate that, and we've seen play out in Western Wyoming. And I should sidestep briefly and just simply acknowledge that our ability to have like these conversations, for example, are made possible because of all of our partners that have made this long-term work happen. So all of our funders, from Game and Fish to BLM to WWNRT, Muley Fanatic Foundation, all of those that have poured in resources to make that possible, but then also just our collaborative partners from Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and then my in BLM Forest Service, and then my whole team who's poured much of their life into all that we do. I mean, all those folks should get the credit. I'm talking to you today, but they should all get the credit for everything that I now have the blessing, that we have the opportunity to be able to share accordingly. And so one of one of the only ways, and so most research occurs over like 2 to 3 years. That's just like a classic research project, 2 or 3 years. But it's difficult to capture big swings in environmental variation or changes in a landscape over 2 to 3 years. And so we've had the blessing and the support to be able to, for example, work on understanding Wyoming range deer for over a decade now. What that has allowed us to do, and what we've seen play out, as you were just referencing, from winter to summer and the connections, after the winters 16, 17, 18, 19, which were two relatively bad winters, we lost about 30% of our population. When we would go back into areas on winter range to basically catch new animals that we had lost the prior winter just to replace our mark sample, there were places on that landscape where we were just not seeing animals anymore. Key parts of the winter range where the animal should have been there. In fact, I mean, there were even days that we would make a concerted effort to say, okay, we're going to go and fly this country, we're going to work this country because there should be animals here, and we come up empty-handed. And so then it begged the question, well, what has happened? We've had the bad winters. It's clearly related to that. But did that mean that animals like just abandoned winter ranges and went somewhere else? Or is there something else that's going on? Well, one thing that we did see, and there's a small signal associated with it, but animals that experience bad winters, and so snow certainly pushes them around a bit on a winter range, right? But one thing that we did see is that animals that experienced a bad winter in following years were more likely to be displaced a little bit if they survived through that bad winter. So whether or not they moved more during a bad winter, as in like shifted their seasonal range around more, didn't influence whether or not they survived a bad winter. But it was if they recalled that experience and then like shifted a bit in subsequent years. However, that didn't explain the gaps in distribution. And so now, remember, oftentimes I think we're talking about, as hunters, we see deer here, or we don't see deer here, right? That's what we're often thinking about.
Yeah.
Well, so here's a situation where on a winter range, crap, we're not seeing deer here anymore. So, what is that? Something affected deer distribution at a level where we're seeing it as we're trying to do our research. Well, then what we did is we also leaned into what we see with regards to what influenced an animal's probability of surviving the winter. And as we've already spoken about some, one of the primary factors is their fat. It's their backpack, whether or not they brought enough with them down to winter range. And so then as we evaluated those gaps in the distribution or those holes, what we saw is the primary factor that created those holes was mortality. Animals in those areas were dying. And if the primary factor that influenced their probability of surviving bad winters is how much fat they brought back with them from summer range, what that tells us is that summer nutrition is influencing population distribution on a winter range, because mule deer especially are so faithful to their world. They stick with it as they migrate from winter range to summer range and back again. And so that faithfulness, if you have summer ranges that are proving to be inadequate, essentially, or animals are not gaining enough fat, after a bad winter, they die, there's not animals coming back there again because they did not have the nutrition to be able to persist on that winter range given those bad winters. So there's a scenario that connects, a very obvious pathway to connect winter to summer range, because it's summer range conditions and their ability to gain fat that are dictating whether or not they survive a winter, which then dictates the population distribution that we see on winter range.
Huh. And as hunters, we want to think this is all just some static thing. What grandpa saw, what dad saw, I should see. And it's, well, and just not possible in a landscape that is changing as rapidly. And a lot of people, this is an example that I have of my own life where I live in Montana, so I go to the same place year after year after year, and the change is happening, but it looks so gradual that it's really hard to think, oh, this it couldn't be a habitat thing. It looks just like it did last year, which looked like pretty close what it was a year before. Well, then, what's always eye-opening for me is I went to college in Reno. So I spent a ton of time in northern Nevada up on the Sheldon and other places hunting chukar, and if I had a deer tag, and the quality of the habitat in the 1980s around there, it looked like what you dreamed of. High alpine mountain, big sea of sage basins. Well, then I start going back there 20, 25, now even 35 years later. And the change in the landscape when you take that picture 30 years apart is so dramatic, from cheatgrass, from the impacts of feral horses, from just so many things. And so it leads me to the question of, is the carrying capacity of a lot of our mule deer range, maybe pronghorn range, is it what it historically was? To my untrained eye, it doesn't look like the carrying capacity would be there in terms of quality and quantity of forage. Or, and so this gets to the hunter's viewpoint of, are we, when we say, boy, I sure wish it was like the 60s. My grandpa used to tell me about there was a 30-inch buck on every knob. Well, things were a lot different in 1964 when I was born than they are today from a habitat standpoint. So are we kidding ourselves if we think we're ever going to get back to the 1960s, to use that term, or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
I wish it was like, whatever period of time someone puts in there. When we have landscape changes that are as dramatic as they've been over the last 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, I remember the first time I drove from Jackson, Wyoming to Rock Springs,
Mm.
1990, 1989. There wasn't hardly any oil and gas infrastructure out there at that time. Now, if you drive there that route, Highway 191 at night, it looks like a lot of small cities out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just using that as an example similar to what I see in Nevada of these, instead of big sage basins of winter habitat, I see big yellowish white waves of cheatgrass. And so no matter where I go in the mule deer range, it just seems like their habitat components have been fractured heavily, which causes me to wonder, are we at carrying capacity based on what the condition of the habitat is and the disruption and impairment of that habitat? I I don't know that answer, but I'm looking for your thoughts or ideas about, am I out to lunch, or are these just realities we have to accept as part of the growing population and part of human impact to fragile species like mule deer?
Yeah, you're definitely not out to lunch, and we'll. And I think there's examples both with what we've seen as we've been talking about within the Wyoming range, but then also what we see big picture to lean into that question. And part of what you're getting at, where we often have a tendency to go, and I think as hunters we have a tendency to go there. Oftentimes it's numbers, right? And much of what you're referring to is a number of animals, a number of deer. Like, man, historically we had this number. Well, I want that number again because things were
Yeah,
amazing back then. Like you said, there was a 30-inch deer around every ridge line. For us to, I think one important thing to consider, even if it's like at the same time a bit discouraging to say, but there's other ways to think about it too that we'll get to. The only way we can think that we can get back to the numbers that we once had is that we still have the habitat or the forage base to support that level of numbers, because at the end of the day, the only way you can get that many animals is if you have the habitat and the forage base to sustain them. If you don't, it doesn't matter what you do, wipe every predator off the landscape, whatever it is that you may do of these other factors that are at play, unless there's the habitat or the forage base there to sustain an abundance that's that huge, then it doesn't matter. We're never going to get there. And as you just went through, in most instances, our presence and the role that we have played within these landscapes hasn't been in a favorable direction to support the habitat or the forage base that's needed to maintain populations, perhaps, that were once at that level. And that plays out in many different ways, right? From habitat management, fire suppression, climate regimes, drying conditions, or you name it, whatever the case may be, that results in different processes of habitat succession, or as you mentioned, invasive species that alter these habitat assemblages severely. In the vast majority of instances, as we think about how that has changed over the past number of decades, it hasn't changed in a favorable manner for mule deer as we think about this browsy, forb loving, early successional habitat preferring species, at least certainly up on summer ranges, but then needing to maintain robust browse species, shrub species from mountain mahogany, bitterbrush, sagebrush on their winter ranges, for example, or you name it, depending upon the country. In most instances, it hasn't progressed in a favorable way. But then the other side of that as well is just our presence, and as our needs have changed and how we've used habitats that have, over time, it hasn't always been in a favorable manner. Whether we put roads in, whether we have rural development or energy development, roads, well pads, basically our activity and the role we play on the landscape isn't independent from these animals being able to make a living, all of which can mean a progressive loss in the capacity of habitat to sustain or support these large populations that we once had. I think that has played out pretty well, and we've been able to paint the picture of that because of our work in Western Wyoming with Wyoming range deer and adjacent populations on Pinedale anticline as well with Hall Sawyer and his work. But basically, when we started our work in Wyoming Range in 2013, and as we progressed from one year to the next, all the way up to the 16-17 winter, even though we had reasonable conditions, even though fawn recruitment was still like barely sustaining a population, the population was just static, but nutritional condition each year just progressively declined leaning into the 16-17 winter. I think we spoke of this a bit before, maybe in our last conversation, but we started that winter at 7% body fat, which isn't great going into a winter. And again, it was a legit winter, but we lost 30% of the population. We then go from there to the 18-19 winter, and then, of course, all the way to the 22-23 winter. The 16-17 winter and the 18-19 winter, after those reductions in abundance, we saw incremental increases in body fat after each one of those events. We also learned, as we spoke a little bit about, these animals and their ability to balance and be programmed in this nutritional cycle for those specific environments. What we've also learned is that they also have the ability, based on experiences, to slightly alter that programming. So not only did we see reductions in density, resulting in improved nutrition and improved body fat levels, but there's this subtle reprogramming as well in how animals allocate that energy that they obtained, either to gaining fat or to provisioning their offspring, as if to sort of reprogram in better preparation for a bad winter, which again is just linking this whole process for these animals as we go from one seasonal range to the next. What that meant, remember, we started 16-17 winter at 7%. We entered the 22-23 winter at 12%. So quite fat, right? But we still lost 70% of our animals during that 22-23 winter because it was so catastrophic and so severe. And our models indicate if we'd have started that winter at 7% body fat like we did in 16-17, we might have lost everything. Our models indicate over 90% mortality if we'd have started at that fat level, further demonstrating the importance of this carryover from summer to winter. And I think important to remember, had we been pushing, like all indications are going into the 16-17 winter, we were at the capacity of the habitat. We couldn't really grow any more deer, maybe roughly around 40,000 deer-ish at that point in time. But we just couldn't grow any more deer. Recruitment rates weren't all that great. And we were certainly, progressively seeing declines in body fat, everything indicating that we were bumped up against it. We then saw the improved condition, might have saved us in the 22-23 winter. Now, after the 22-23 winter, we have severe reduction in density, right? Once we lose 70%. Since that time, man, we have seen the fattest animals that we've ever seen through the course of our study. We've had to adjust the y-axes on our figure because the data wouldn't fit in the figures anymore because the animals are so fat. Our fawn birth masses are also bigger than we've ever seen, like almost a pound heavier on average compared with prior years, and the highest fawn survival that we've ever seen. And that has been maintained even going into this year. Even though we haven't had the best forage conditions, we are still maintaining impressively fat animals. And in fact, for the past 2 Marches, we have finished winter, which we'll see what comes this year, but we finished winter at 7% body fat. So ending winter at 7%. We began winter in 16-17 at 7%, which I think just demonstrates the level of fat that these animals are at this point in time. And granted, there's moisture that plays a role and everything else, but the biggest change on that landscape, even after we count for those factors, is the reduction in density, the less competition for food on the landscape, which also points back to what you were mentioning previously. Are we bumping up against carrying capacity given the changes that we've seen in the landscape over time? Are we just not able to get there? And I think the message of that whole story, as it's laid out, as density has been reduced in the Wyoming range, we are seeing that return in condition, nutritional condition, body fat, fawn survival, fawn recruitment, which is demonstrating to us and the power of that long-term data set that, yeah, the number of animals is playing a role. And at that period of time, at least based on current habitat conditions, current moisture regime, we were at the capacity of what was present there in our ability to grow a greater abundance of animals. We were there. Now, of course, that's reflecting those conditions at that point in time,
Right.
which I think we can all acknowledge is not the same as it was 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
It's different now. And the animals, through what they've experienced over the past decade and a half or so there, have basically demonstrated that for us by way of the dynamics in the population, the changes in body fat that we've seen, as well as the changes in survival and recruitment of young at the same time. And I think, to remember within the context of that, our presence on the landscape, while there's certainly the changes in habitat that you think associated with habitat succession, habitat management, those sorts of things, but our presence on the landscape, depending upon how we quantify that or how we look at it, rarely comes for free.
Right.
There's give and
Someone
take
pays
on
a price for that.
Yeah, there's give and take on either side of that. Now, while we have to live, we have to survive as well. At the same time, the things we do rarely come for free. And when you have animals, for example, like a migratory mule deer population that live in these fairly pristine environments over summer and then come back down to a winter range that may not look as pristine anymore, one, if we've altered the winter range, as you referenced, energy development or rural development or whatever, we've taken habitat and it's been removed. We've removed food from their landscape. However, at the same time, for these deer, they also don't want to be around that at the same time. So there's a strong aversion to those processes that are happening on the landscape that's causing them to live further away from it, so to speak. And so what that means is, from what they're willing to accept behaviorally on that landscape, there's food that may be there, but the animals are just unwilling to make complete use of it. So what that means is there's forage that's being lost because animals are behaviorally not making use of it anymore, which means what we see as our effect is often underestimated relative to what the animals are experiencing, and then how that plays out in a population at the same time.
Yeah. Is that it's, you sent me a study that you and Hall Sawyer and a couple others had done about how much of the forage within surface developments in western Wyoming was there, but how much of it they actually use. So there might be a whole backpack full of really high nutritional stuff, but because of the human disturbance factor, they'll avoid it.
Yeah.
So if
Yep.
they avoid it, is it still habitat to be considered in the availability of deer, of numbers, of carrying capacity? If just our presence there, in whatever form that might be,
Mm-hmm.
causes them to not utilize it or to avoid it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an important way, I think, for us to acknowledge what it means for the animals. And what we saw while working across the three winter ranges in that country is, on average, for every 1 acre of direct habitat loss, for example, if something, we go in and remove habitat to put a structure in a place, and let's say it takes up an acre, we get rid of an acre of food. Given the presence there, which it is variable, deer's response is variable based on how much human activity there are and those sorts of things in those places. But on average, what we see is that for every 1 acre, there's 4.6 more times food that's lost on the landscape. So 1 acre, 4.6, that's simply lost because of their behavior and their unwillingness to use it. Now, we see it as still being there, but it's functionally not available to the deer. I mean, so what that means is we can essentially, I think, a way to think about that is, we may see things intuitive to us on the landscape plays out differently for the animals that reside on that landscape in their ability to make use of those places. And so if the process plays out in that way, it's kind of like functionally putting a fence around that area. For the deer, it's a behavioral fence. It's a fence they're not willing to cross, so to speak. Now, it's an oversimplification of it that's associated with the degree to which they use those areas. but we're functionally putting a fence on it. We can still see that it's there, but the deer's not willing to cross the fence. What that essentially means, in as we began with this, the foundation for a population and their abundance is their carrying capacity, the habitat, and the food that's present there. If we are taking away habitat and food, even if it's influenced in this indirect process by how it alters behavior of the animals, it's going to have a net effect on the carrying capacity of that landscape over time.
Yeah. That one of the good things about being as old as I am, Kevin, is now I can go back and pull out numbers, and it sounds like Grandpa talking.
Well, at least you're
But
owning it.
yeah, I have to. I have no choice. I look in the mirror every day, and I have to own it. But I look at a lot of the Western states, and I went and did the research of in my lifetime all the factors of human presence. It can be habitat impairment because of, hey, we need more housing. We
Mhm.
Everybody who doesn't want their 5 or 10 acres, right? We all do.
Yep. Yep.
We build more roads, we build more cities. Our energy demands, even as urban areas grow, most of that energy comes from disproportionately the rural areas.
Yep.
So the ratio or the percentage of expansion of population in urban areas has an impact of the human presence in these formerly wild areas, a relative, whatever term that might be. Well, then there's also the factor of just how many people are out on the landscape every day, all day, hiking, mountain biking, dog walking, whatever. And we're starting to see some studies about that. But in my head, I struggle to, well, I don't struggle to, I easily connect the dot that Nevada has seen a 750% increase in population in my lifetime. It's probably safe to say that results in many more multiples of displacement of lactating does and their fawns because there's that many more people hiking and mountain biking and whatever. And Colorado, 300% increase in population. Utah, 350% increase. Arizona, 500% increase. So, if part of the habitat utility, even if, like you were saying, okay, there might be forage there, but if the utilization of that is impacted by human presence all day, every day, with us being out there, and
Mhm.
I'm the last guy who wants to say, hey, don't go on a hike there. There's mule deer over there, or
Mhm.
there's cow elk and their calves over there.
Mhm.
I I want to have a realistic view of what is the true carrying capacity of this habitat and all of its components based on population growth in the Rocky Mountain areas or the areas of mule deer that is to such a dramatic degree.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
and whatever that might be, it's very logical for me to say if I want to see herd numbers even stay the same, no matter the species, I better be doing all I can to make sure the habitat quality stays at the highest level I can advocate for, but also the quantity of it that is usable,
Mhm.
that is utilized, stays as high as possible. And that gets me back to I went down the path. I grew up trapping and I paid for college by coyote hunting when I can't believe in 1985 I sold coyotes for $75 a piece, bobcats for $350 a piece. Uh, but I'm all about the balance of what we need to do with predation. When you've compromised species to the margins of their habitat, like we have through our human presence, they're more susceptible to predation, and I'm willing to be a participant in helping to offset or balance some of that. But it makes it so easy for me to look at it that way and say, and I think you might have referenced something similar to this earlier, is if we got rid of every lion, every bear, every coyote, every wolf, if we continue on a path we are of human growth, human presence, and the compromise that has for habitat, we're we're kidding ourselves if we think we're going to shoot our way out of this by shooting coyotes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't. I know some people right now are like, Newberg, you're an idiot, man. Every time I shoot a coyote, I save a fawn. Well, I worry that that takes our eye off what the bigger picture is, and that's why your research that you and so many others of the associates you mentioned is so valuable to us. And I want to just make sure people are thinking about it of, all right, yeah, there's all these little levers, right? Like hunting harvest has some influence on population, but that's mostly a byproduct of what the population is and what the our game managers are going to let aren't going to let that go outside the boundaries. So hunting has these little impacts. Predation has some impacts. All everything does have some impacts. But how do we get people to understand that if you want fat does, you better focus on the quantity and quality of that habitat? Or is that just, we better accept that that's boring and that's dry and nobody wants to hear that because that's a complicated problem?
I mean, that's very true. That's where the eyes like glaze over, like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, what are we supposed to do about that? I think oftentimes the way that I've worked to characterize this is that yes, there are all those little levers, notably some, some of which may be good, as like depending upon what you view as good, right? So for example, in the Wyoming range, like the deer that remain have reaped the benefits of the dramatic reduction in numbers. And frankly, that's probably going to equate to bigger bucks being present down the road because they're given the silver spoon right out of the gate because the moms are fat, etc. Which also means that as we think about numbers, we often fall victim to the numbers game, which I think we can do better than that. And especially as we begin to think about fat moms, like that leads us down a pathway where it's not just all about numbers. However, as you also noted, like there are a lot of things that may have some impacts in some places, and in some places they play more of a role than of others. But no matter what, if we don't have the habitat or the food that's there, we can't grow more animals than what is present there. And as we sit and look at these situations, I think sometimes, oh, and we may be accused of this as well, just like pointing the fingers at others. Oh, it's energy development. Oh, it's rural development. Well, yeah, well, it's recreation over here. Well, yeah, it's all predators. And the thing is I think oftentimes we would do a bit better, maybe, to just acknowledge that, yeah, like if our if, how we use the landscape affects the animals in some instances more so than others, and perhaps acknowledging that and maybe owning, yes, if we're going to have rural development here, it's going to influence the animals. If we're going to punch roads in here, or we're going to explore energy development here, it's going to influence the animals. As outdoor recreation grows, there's still more to learn there, right? But as you can imagine, just with all the other things, all the other evidence that stacks up there, if it becomes stronger and more pervasive, as we've seen in a handful of studies that are out there on this emerging topic, it is going to influence the animals. And it could, in the same way of basically so-called displacing them out of otherwise usable habitat. And so if that's resulting in a functional loss of habitat in some way, it's going to influence the population, which simply means, I believe, is as we consider, conservation over the long term, if our goal is to maintain, if our goal is to improve, I mean, at minimum, we can own the processes that are happening across the landscape, do our best while acknowledging that to make smart decisions, whether it be by placement, whether it be by timing, or whatever those activities are or use of habitats are over the longer term. Rather than, I think sometimes it's just sort of, it's almost like we pretend we're just going to sweep it under the rug. Nah, it'll be okay. I think just owning it in all the different facets probably going to do us a lot better over the long term to get behind concerted efforts in conservation if the goal is for maintenance or even improving conditions over time.
Yeah. And you do a great job of keeping me on the path of the straight and narrow, Kevin, because you always say, Randy, I get where you're going with this question. I understand it. I'm a hunter. I share some of these same concerns, but I'm here to advocate for the science. You always say that. And that is really good for me to hear because I'm here to advocate for the wildlife, which sometimes means I'm advocating against a lot of the human uses
Mm-hmm.
of the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And that really pisses a lot of people off.
Mm-hmm.
And I get it. And I'm seeing it through my lens. So the things I'm advocating for on behalf of the wildlife are through my lens, and someone else is going to see that landscape's best use through a different lens.
Yep, that's right.
Uh, but I always appreciate that you you won't. I don't know what you'd say. You won't take my bait when I'm trying to get you to answer a question to advocate for my position. And you always say, no, I'm here for the science. I'm here for the science, which is really helpful for me because it forces me to think about it as we're humans. So I'm never going to see it. I'd like to say I'm being objective, but right. One thing I've learned of getting old and gray is none of us are ever quote unquote objective.
Yeah, agreed.
Objective is
Yeah,
relative, and
yeah,
objective is subjective, is what I
yeah,
always say.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but
Good
you
way to
make
put
a good point there that we do have a lot of data, we have a lot of research, and hopefully your research can continue for decades and decades because when we're in a lot of these studies, when you're saying, these are 2 to 3 year studies is kind of the norm.
it. Mm-hmm.
I operate, right, I'm a CPA, I'm in the business and finance world. Most things I worry about is quarterly, like every 3 months. And so I'm like, man, you guys really have a long view, 2 to 3 years. Uh, but I would hope for something as important as wildlife and the habitat it requires and the human pressures it brings, or the pressures human presence brings, that we can do these studies over decades and decades. Because I'm gonna quote you on this,
Mm.
and don't you dare deny it.
Uh-oh.
Uh, One time I asked you a question and you said, Randy, well, I get where you're going, but here's what the data says. And if we decide to use that data in this way or that way, or we decide to ignore that data, or our priorities say, yeah, that's the data and that's what the outcomes will be, but we're going to do it anyhow. You said, and you said this term earlier, is you said, then we have to own it.
Mm-hmm.
We know enough about what's going on. If we decide to do things that aren't in the favor of wildlife, then we better own that decision.
Mm-hmm.
And as weird as that might come across, that really opened my eyes of maybe it's not so much trying to educate everyone and sway everyone to my view of advocacy for wildlife, as I should just say, okay, but you're going to have to own this.
Yeah.
We collectively are going to have to own this.
Yeah.
If I want to go and hike every summer day at the trailhead a half mile from my house, and me and the 200 other people using that trail every day are bumping deer, we better own it.
Mm-hmm.
That our presence is having a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not have seen it as that much of a epiphany to me, but it was. It's like, you know what? Maybe my job doesn't have to be to convince the whole world that my view of prioritization for wildlife is the only view. Maybe I just tell people, okay, here's what the data says. I guess we get to own this if this is our decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
And hopefully that maybe that makes it easier in some ways. I think it would be hard to be a scientist, is it? To see human pressures on the landscape, is it hard to be a scientist and try to
Well, I
be
mean,
as objective as you're supposed to be?
yeah, there's lots of ways that make it hard to be a scientist. There's lots of things that contribute to that, but I mean, yeah, it's one of those things where it's hard, but it's also, I think it's a tremendous blessing and an opportunity and a responsibility that I believe we face at the same time. We're blessed to be able to get to see animals, connect with animals at a level of intimacy that few others in the world will ever have the opportunity to. And so that's an incredible blessing. But I believe also it's on us then at the same time to do our best for the sake of the animals and the data that we gain from that to communicate it soundly in a objective way to own what it is, do our best to remove our preconceived biases because we can have them too, and just be the voice on behalf of the data, which also means the animals. What are the animals telling us that we can appreciate and hold dear? And it's on us then to take that to the rest of the people of the world. It's not on us to make the decisions as to what we're going to do. Really, we want to be able to provide and equip for decision making to happen, whether that means it's made in favor of wildlife or not, or whatever the case may be. But at least the information's on the table. Ideally, we're all at the same table, all owning the same information. We wrestle with those decisions as to whatever that looks like, or at least the powers reference with those decisions with respect to whatever that looks like. And then we're owning what it is. We're acknowledging the pluses, the minuses on either side, because there always is. And then we go forth from there. I think one of the hardest things is, as a scientist, is when the information can be so clear, it is so obvious, and yet it's like denied as if it's not a thing. Like it's almost, put your fingers in your ears and pretend like you didn't hear that. And at least just like, well, no, it's fine. If that's where you're going to, like, if this is the action, that's going to be the priority and the outcome, fine. But don't pretend like we don't know these things over here. And I think that is perhaps the greatest frustration, because then it undermines what the animals have told us, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, there's a reason why I wouldn't make a good wildlife commissioner. I've through the course of governors in Montana, I've been asked to serve on our Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission, and I've declined mostly because I've been too busy. But as I've gotten older, I realize I would be a terrible commissioner from the standpoint of I think commissioners are supposed to take the science, take the human side of it,
Hmm.
and mash, all right, how do we make this work? One is super subjective, the
Yep.
desires of hunters or non hunters or whoever,
Yep.
with the science and try to make the best decision. And I
Hmm.
would default so far to the side of the wild things, the
Hmm.
governor would have to fire me. I would just suck at it.
Yep.
I'd be like, well, too bad. The deer need this, or the pronghorn need this, or the
Hmm.
sheep need this, and it
Hmm.
piss off a lot of people.
Hmm.
I, I
It's
just,
a, I think, as you know, it comes down to that goal aspect. I mean, if we define wildlife management, I think one of the best definitions of it is the art and science of manipulating the human user, the animals, or the habitat to achieve some desired goal, right? And so, kind of what you're talking about, what is the desired goal? And that plays into, of course, our stakeholders, the human users, but also then what that means, big picture as well. And that's it. It's a hard thing. So, yeah, but I think more and more, if we have sound information, good science. If we can at least own that information, I think our pathway forward can be at least more acknowledged, accepted as to what it's going to mean, as opposed to quibbling over what is or what isn't with respect to what we anticipate happening given various decisions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's, I don't know, maybe I'm getting old, maybe I'm getting lazy, but I I don't have a lot of time for the arguments and I call it the smoke and mirrors that based on what we know, there's going to be a different outcome. Trust me, there will be a different that won't happen.
It'll be fine. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my mind, I don't have the energy for the mental exercise to try follow whatever logic usually tells me, trust me.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I just, that my my ability to anymore to give preference to the human uses of landscapes is drying up.
Mm.
Uh, and it's really a contradiction because I live in a house. I need natural gas to heat that house. I've taken up space.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was a subdivision from 40 years before I moved here, but I'm still there.
Yep.
Everything I do in my life has some consequence
Hmm.
to wild things.
Hmm.
And I can be as aware of it as I want to be, but there's no denying when I get up in the morning, I'm driving in town, get my cup of coffee, drive to my office. Somehow I'm having an impact.
Yep.
So if I'm going to be here and have an impact, what am I doing to help on the other end of that? I guess is where I've come down on this and why for me it's all about what can I do for wildlife? What can I do for wildlife? I know that me being here has a consequence that they are writing the checks for me having a house that's heated, that I have gas in my truck, that all the amazing luxuries I have as an American, a lot of that is paid for with wildlife and habitat and
Hmm.
their ability to sustain. So the way I've rationalized it in my head, and some psychologists would say, Newberg, you are so out to lunch. But the way I've rationalized it over my lifetime of interacting in all of it is I just got to do what I can. I got to do more.
Hmm.
How can I be this louder voice, whether it's through money, through volunteerism, through influencing policy, through whatever. And that's an accountant trying to simplify all the complicated stuff that you guys work on and try to bring it to audiences in a way that hopefully some of them see that through a similar lens
Yeah.
and they want to advocate for the wild things. And
No, I think that's beautiful. In fact, to bring it full circle from where we started our conversation, we named our event here Echoes of the Tracks, and in part because we can look at a map, we can plot GPS data on a map, and we see okay, these are the tracks that the deer went, and we're in the field and we see tracks. Those GPS tracks, those tracks that we see in the field, they didn't get there by accident. They're there for a reason, and that reason is going to cross generational time and is going to speak back to the history of that landscape, of the animals that live there, the habitat over time. And so those tracks, as we lean in more to it, can tell us a lot more about what has happened and also what we can anticipate coming if we can understand what that means for the animal, what it's going to mean for her offspring over generational time, and what it's going to mean for conservation long term. And even as you just described, you're describing the echoes of your tracks on the landscape and even the echoes that came before that, from the presence of people there to the subdivisions to whatever that may be. There's everything that we do, and perhaps even everything that an animal does to persist over time, and the progeny that continue to live there over time. there's ripples that go out from that. It's the echoes that occur and continue to persist. And so I think it's important for us to think about that. There's more to just the here and now than the here and now.
Right.
It goes back and it goes forward at the same time. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Kevin, I could steal way more of your time every time we get together. I've already borrowed some of your time 10 days ago. Glad I didn't give you
Me too.
whatever kind of pox I came up with. But I really look forward to getting together in Laramie. And folks, if you can't make that event, if you there's a website for that event, right?
Mm-hmm.
I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
if I can't remember what the Google term would be, but go check it out. And if you're interested in supporting the work that Kevin and his team does, I got to meet a couple of them down there. Angela and I'm trying to remember who the other person was. Was it Angela?
Yeah,
I
you
met.
met Angie there, and then you met
Yeah,
I think, and Ty, and yep,
yeah.
yep. So
I may meet so many people at a show.
I'm impressed you remembered that name for that matter. That's
But
incredible for as many people as you meet. Yeah.
uh, but anyhow, if you want to support their work, go.
MonteithShop.org.
There you
Easy
go.
access our website. The event is there as well. And there's ways to, yeah, get connected, see some of the things we're working on. And yeah, we, of course, welcome support. We can't do what we do without all the people, all the supporters and partners that make it possible. So otherwise, our conversations would be really boring, Randy.
You want to know where I want what I want to do for my next podcast with you, Kevin?
Tell me, what do you got?
I want to do it out on a pronghorn hunt in Wyoming.
Oh, let's do
Because
it. I'm game.
last time when you revealed your pronghorn problem
Mm-hmm.
being an affliction about equivalent to mine, I'm like, all right, this is a guy who I need to go pronghorn hunting with, even if I don't have the tag. If you just want someone to be a really bad camp cook, you
Yeah.
just call me.
Okay, let's
I'll
do
be
it,
your
man.
guy.
I'm game. I'm game.
All right.
They're incredible. Yeah, one of God's greatest creations. I love it. I'm ready to go.
Yeah. Yeah. The downside is I have not shot a pronghorn for 3 years.
Oh, that's terrible.
I have been swapping and trading and bumming for pronghorn meat.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm so
it's
sorry.
I know it's the closest thing to a tragedy that has struck in my adult lifetime is for
Yeah,
my freezer to be void of pronghorn.
that's a shame. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's nothing better.
No,
Nothing better than pronghorn steak. Yep.
no, not at all. But anyhow, I'll see you next month. And thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks for the work you do. Thanks for being an advocate for the science, keeping guys like me honest and on the track, but also willing to share so much of what you know with people who are concerned about wildlife.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for getting the word out, Randy. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.